All right, hello everyone. Welcome to the February 14, 2024 meeting of SIG-Auth. Let's get started. Here's the agenda we have. Mo, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, so I wanted to ask about this. So to give some background on the sort of like the problem statement, today, we can have service account tokens that are generated from Kube Controller Manager, and we can have service account tokens that are generated by API server. Obviously, one of them is a legacy flow. In simple installations, all of this uses the same set of public and private keys, so there's really no separation between these mechanisms. But you can provide separate private keys to each component. And if you host your well-known endpoint in like a cloud something somewhere, so it's not the actual API server endpoint, when you expose your trust to external parties outside of the cluster, you can very finely control which public keys are in there. And thus, you can make it impossible for an external verifier to ever authenticate a key that's issued by a Kube controller manager. What you cannot do is within the cluster, the well-known endpoint that's on the API server itself, it will always contain all of the public keys, irregardless of which verifier it's going to use, the legacy verifier or the new verifier, right?
It contains all the public keys that you give the Kube API server to verify with.
Yes, but you have to give it the ones for KCM, or otherwise it cannot verify legacy tokens at all because the input is the same.
Yeah. So the public keys served by the Kube API server are the ones that it is using to verify tokens presented to it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. And so what I want to be possible is I want to be able to set up my well-known endpoint from my cloud endpoint and the API server to have the same data, which is explicitly saying for OIDC style discovery, I only allow these public keys. And
So
if
you
you
want
want,
the API server to accept Kubernetes servicing out tokens, but not advertise that in its OIDC discovery?
right, so I can already do this when I host the endpoint myself because those keys don't have a meaning outside of the cluster. Right. And when I look at the well-known endpoint for discovery, that's how I rationalize that, right? Like I'm not saying token review shouldn't work with KCM issued service account tokens. Obviously it should, right? I'm just in a way, this is my step zero before we have anything for like external signing of service account tokens, is I want to separate the trust between API server issued tokens and Kube Controller Manager. Very specifically.
It seems very strange for Kube API server to trust the public keys to use the token against Kube API server, but then not include it in the public keys
No, it's
advertised.
strange, right? Because the public keys advertised are only for OpenID formatted connect tokens, right? And KCM ones are not that way. They're not compliant. They don't have the right claims. They don't have an EXP claim, for example, right? So it's not the same thing. It's actually distinctly unrelated concepts that because of the history of the project are glued together.
Is it true that the KCM issued ones?
Yeah, if they were, we wouldn't have to make a new format. We would have just used the old format.
Huh.
Right. So I would actually argue that it's a bug that they're in there because they don't make sense in that context.
Okay. Okay. I think I buy that.
I don't know, Mike, I know you weren't feeling well, but if you had any thoughts, I would love to hear them since you wrote a huge chunk of this feature set. So
Can you,
So
maybe I'm not Mike, but why is this step 0 for external signing?
yeah, I don't
Um,
understand that. I see the value of splitting it, I guess. But I don't see why it's
the way I was thinking about it in that regard was that when it comes to external signing, I think you have to answer the question of, does external signing apply to KCM as well? Because it can issue tokens, right? And I think the way I would answer that is no, it doesn't. And the reason it doesn't is because those tokens are not the tokens that are meant for external consumption and where you need that external signer for your hardening, right? KCM issued tokens have no meaning outside of the cluster.
So
But
we're
they're
actually
still-
evaluating that
they're still
like
valid.
right now. And I think that, at least for us, the answer is like, if we're going to do external signing, we need it for everything. We don't want any keys on the VM.
So like, I think the question about whether or not it's related to external signing, I agree. I don't see how it's related to external signing. I do think that if you have different keys for KCM and API server, then only advertising the keys that we're making OIDC style tokens from in the OIDC public key set endpoint makes sense.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if there's enough information in the flags that exist on API server today to distinguish. I think it's munged. Yeah. So we would have to enhance it to make it do that, or make it possible to express that. Which I'm more than happy to do. That part's not hard. So I guess since we're talking about it to here, so so your thought process, well, let me explain. So the reason I felt like that we could not have KCM be signed, and that's okay, is that if we very explicitly make it so they never have any meaning outside of the cluster.
Meaning outside the cluster isn't the only consideration. Like meaning inside the cluster is still meaningful.
Sure.
So like external signing has value even inside the cluster.
Yeah, I guess I took the rationale for wanting to do the hardening is that when you use the well-known endpoint to distribute these key sets, is that it's part of a larger system where you're chaining a bunch of trust, right? And that's where it starts to matter a lot more that key is hardened. Like basically, if you screw it up within the cluster, then the cluster is compromised, right? But if the cluster was trust anchored to a bunch of random other things, then all of the things are broken instead of just a cluster. But if we go down the route of everything has to be externally signed, and we have all the certs to deal with, all the service account tokens, all the legacy service account tokens on KCM, right? So I mean, maybe you could split it up, but that seems really, really painful.
Well, so I mean, certs are like, we already provide enough flexibility for whatever platform provider to do whatever the heck they want. They just turn off the KCM one and turn on their own re-implementation.
Oh, no. What I mean is like certs, like serving certificates and things like that, right? Like the other ends of the trust too, right? Like for example, when you connect to API server, right, it has a private key on disk which it's using to complete the
Sure.
dialog.
Okay, I see what you mean. We
Right? If you can
what we're worried
that,
about is root keys. We want no root keys on VMs. Ideally, there would be no leaf keys on VMs, but you know, that's much harder.
I guess like, so today Cube API server includes all the public keys it's given for token validation in its OIDC endpoint. If you would split private keys between KCM issuing non-OIDC tokens and Cube API server issuing OIDC shaped tokens, your key set would include public keys for both of those. Anyone actually using those would fail to validate KCM issued tokens because they don't have the X claim. So it's not like is it messy to include those public keys there? Yeah. Do I, if you were like very carefully partitioning those to like legacy signer and new OIDC signer, is it gross to put both of those public keys into your key set? Yeah, it is. Are the KCM issued tokens going to be able to be validated by things doing OIDC validation? No, they're not. So
I think so. The caveat there is we have had bugs where not all apps are well designed and they don't strictly check payloads as well as they should.
Okay, like if the threat model is people are going to use these key sets and then like
No, the issue is that
validate
the crypto validation comes from the library, so you just use it and it works. But then the application specific validation tends to come from the application for looking at the payload, and that doesn't always work out so well. And I see this having seen specific bugs that are very much in that shape. That the crypto was right, but then the meaning of the token was misinterpreted. But I get what you're saying, though. You're basically saying if you're actually doing this correctly, then the public keys being present there doesn't necessarily have.
You've got an extra public key, which is messy, but the tokens that KCM issues would not actually be valid. Yeah, I don't see how this is a prereq for the external signing. I would actually want the external signing thing to be to have an idea of how we would hook up KCM to it as well.
Okay, I mean, and that's fine, right? If that's the approach we want, then you're right. This isn't a step zero. My thought process was I don't think we want KCM, and thus we have to decide how to separate it out. But if we do want KCM, fine. That's
it's
fine.
part of the surface area. I don't see how we get away from it. Like we don't make them automatically. We cleaned up ones that aren't used, but it's part of the surface area, and people definitely use them. I don't see how we get away from them.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that's fine.
I would say I don't really have an opinion one way or another on if we do this split. Like I can see why someone might want separate, KCM tokens to be signed from a separate route.
Yeah, so you can already sign them from a separate route. You just can't set up your trust on the well-known endpoint that the API server serves to distinguish the difference. Obviously, when you rehost the endpoint in some cloud somewhere, you just put whatever keys you want in there because you can just
So this would be concretely, we would just add another flag to Cube API server so that we have one flag that says what you use to verify tokens and one flag that says what you publish in the OIDC endpoint.
I don't know how we would.
I'd have to look. It's kind of like the flags are a little bit messy because there's a lot of stuff going on.
Sounds like
we want to figure out like the least confusing way to do this. Like the only use case where this makes sense, I think, is when you have split like KCM and Cube API server. So like some way to indicate like here's the public keys you use to validate, like the existing flag continues to mean what it means today. Maybe we grow a new flag to say like public keys to validate KCM specifically, and for validation purposes we munge those together, and for publishing purposes we just publish the public keys that we publish today. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I guess in my head I had thought about, I don't know if it'd be one flag or two new flags, but it would basically be these are the keys that I publish at the well-known endpoint, and those are also the ones I use for new style tokens. These are the keys that I use for KCM, and I never publish them anywhere.
I think that's what I just said.
Okay.
I don't feel super strongly about doing this. I don't see it as a prereq, and I don't think the consequences of putting an extra public key in there that won't actually validate tokens using OIDC is that bad, honestly. So I'm sort of on the fence about whether it's worth the complexity. If someone wanted to chase it and it wasn't that horrible, I guess I'm fine with independent control. I don't know. Let's does that work for you? Can we move on to the next topic?
Yeah, that sounds good. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. So next topic. Like just making sure nobody else had anything on the first one. I was gonna ask. So I have seen in my time some very annoyingly slow client Go credential plugins, and I wanted to ask if anyone would feel bad if I updated that code to basically once per kubectl invocation effectively complain that the client Go credential plugin is really slow, so that it's obvious that it's your local machine wasting a bunch of time and not the network.
Do we, like, if you run it verbosity, do we already include enough information to see that that's what's happening? Like if you run it like -v, whatever it is, where you can see like network traces, like 6, I think, is the first level where you can see like network timing and stuff.
I don't know off the top of my head if you could tell, because it's in the round tripper, so it might just appear to be part of the network latency.
I would start by trying to put enough information at the verbosity level where we start doing network stuff, so that if someone cared, they're like, this is slow, what's so slow? And we're like, well, run this to see what your network timing is like. And it would be obvious, like, oh, the local authentication call took X time.
So sorry, can you say that one more time, Jordan? I don't know if I fully followed you.
I would do it as like trace logging at the same verbosity level where we start outputting network request timing. So if stuff is slow and you wanted to see why, you would run it like -v6, I think. And you can see like, here's the network requests and here's how long they're taking. And so at that verbosity level, I would also want to see, here's a call out to a client exec credential plugin that took this much time. So it'd be obvious, oh, the slow bit is the exec plugin.
So I mean, I think that's fair to do. I guess my concern there is I don't know if it's sufficient. Like I don't know if people understand the system well enough to be like, it's slow because my plugin is slow versus my network is slow versus Cube is just slow or my computer is slow.
I don't think we should start spitting warnings because their stuff is slow. Like if they say my stuff is slow, our answer is run at this verbosity level to see why.
Yeah, I think I was more framing as it would be nice if we could be proactive and help people notice that there's things wrong. Like it shouldn't take your plugin 100 milliseconds to run, right? Like it's getting a cred. That's what I mean, right? And I'm really talking about the kubectl use case. Like I see Mike commented about like if I use the sometimes thing. So we might have like might literally be a log once per authenticator struct.
I don't think we should elevate that to a warning. I think we should make it easy to see that it's happening at the point where someone was like tracing to see network timing.
Okay. 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 Anybody else have anything on this? I think that mostly covers that topic.
Is this something that we could maybe output a warning when you do cluster info? Or something that people do when they, just want to see if their connection is good? kubectl version.
I don't know if we have there's not like a kubectl tell me what's wrong. command, I don't think. Not sure if there's a. I think what you're getting at, Leigh, though, is like, is there a contextually relevant place where such information would be more valuable than not?
Yeah, I would think like kubectl cluster info is kind of the standard command that you would run if you're like, what am I connected to, and am I, like connected to the right place, and is it working?
I don't think warning about local exec plugins there makes sense. And like, also, some plugins can do things that are slow occasionally, but then cache locally, right? Like if they are going and getting a cert or going and getting a token, that's good for a few hours and then caching it locally, like maybe it will take 100 milliseconds of one time it requests it, and then it's fast until that thing expires, right? Like I don't think we can unambiguously say like there's like 100 milliseconds is bad and we should smack the user in the face with it. Like if it's slow, they'll complain to whoever gave them their config, or the person who is responsible for that config will also experience the slowness. I don't know. I just don't think we can say like, context free, this is how long it should take, and we can just warn statelessly all the time about it. I don't know.
I guess what more would want is some kind of trace or metrics mode of kubectl where it would actually take that data and save it locally in kube cache or something like that, such as
we have trace mode.
Sorry.
That's what I think it's fine to dump out the data in trace mode. I think that's super helpful. I thought we were already doing it. We might already be doing it.
I mean that if you kind of set some config like trace or something in the kube config, then it would actually save for all of the kind of invocations it does in a Prometheus style format or something, to local disk. That's what you would like, and then you have the kubectl tell me what's wrong, which would read those Prometheus metrics or whatever, and then you can see that okay, occasionally I don't know, the P95 of my client credential thing is like 500 milliseconds, but most often P50 is 2 or something like that.
Yeah, so I think
but I don't know.
Is basically things like kubectl don't tend to persist long-term state. And I think to your point, Jordan, yeah, it is totally valid for a plugin to be occasionally slow when it fetches a credential and caches it. The case I'm more annoyed by is when a plugin is miswritten and thus, or misconfigured actually, where it's constantly doing something that is slowing itself down, and thus much slower than it should be, even though it is caching.
Yeah,
I
I know. Sorry.
I suppose like when I think about other tools that have very pluggable, authentication, like say SSH, it doesn't necessarily tell me, hey, your SSH connection is subjectively slow every time you log into one of these 50 machines. And I just get annoyed by that, for a year until I put it on my backlog or something, right? And then we go and look into it.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's very obvious that it's the credential plugin that's messing up, because I know how kubectl and all the wiring works. So like, it's also extra infuriating for me because I know it should be fast. So that's why, like, I had noticed this, right? I had noticed this being broken in multiple cloud providers and multiple vendors, and I was hoping to try to elevate it into something that's more obvious so they would actually fix it.
I don't think that is our place to do.
Yeah, which is fine. I think that's like a philosophical disconnect on this one.
Is there something that would be maybe more visible to the developer of the plugin? Something that's part of the dev experience of implementing that credential plugin that might show up in their CI system, or
Rita, you had the question about metrics. So there would be metrics would only be client side in this case. So I don't think there's any persistence of any state between API server and client. And now I forgot what you.
There are metrics actually, but for short-lived processes like kube control, there's no endpoint to scrape metrics from. So if you were using client Go in a context where it was longer lived and you had a metrics endpoint, so like kubelet uses client Go. You can give the kubelet a kube config that is configured with an exec credential plugin, and so the metrics around that totally get served by the kubelet. You can observe like how long is it taking, is it succeeding, when was the last rotation, all of the things like that you would want. But for kube control, like there's no metrics endpoint, first of all, and like as soon as the process exits, like all of the understanding of what it called and the metrics around it are gone.
I
Yeah,
think
so that's what I meant, that maybe that's what Mo wants, like some way to push those metrics into some place, and then there's a kubectl plugin or something that, you know, is a long-lived process which actually takes care of those, and then you can ask that plugin that, okay, so today I've been spending a lot of time doing invocations with kubectl, but now I want to see what is taking so long, right? And then it's all stored there.
Yeah. I think for stuff like kubelet, like most of this doesn't matter because it's not a interactive process. So like no one is really inconvenienced by taking half a second or whatever to do auth. Yeah, that's where it's kind of hard, right? Is because kubectl is I'm using it. I want it to be fast. I want it to feel nice. I don't know if we're done with this topic. If we are, we could maybe talk with Tahir about the cluster trust bundle stuff. Did you want to start, Tahir?
Sure, yeah. So basically, we kind of squeezed in CAP 3257, the cluster trust bundles, promoting them to beta, right under the wire, a little past the wire. So I think the concrete work we expect at right now is like actually moving those APIs into V1 beta 1. And then like maybe there's some feature gate work to make sure that we're not dependent on alpha, you know, enabling alpha features. But there were some open questions in the KEP that we had like explicitly said we're punting these to beta, and then we were at beta and we had not considered them at all. I've listed them down below. Basically, revocation. Do we want to have some sort of standardized revocation like way for signer implementations to communicate revocation information for certificates issued from the roots that correspond to the public keys in the cluster trust bundle? Then there is some other ones around like, hey, so today we published some stuff in config maps, right? Like the Kube API server. When you have an automatically injected Kube API access volume, it reads the correct root certificate from Kube API server from a config map that has to be pushed down into every namespace. Maybe we should do that via cluster trust bundle instead. And what's the last one? Let's scroll down off the screen now. Oh, and the other one is like, should we be able to refer to cluster trust bundles from webhook configs so that it's super easy to tell Kube API server how you what is the correct route to trust, and you don't have to keep updating the webhook config.
There's also we said that we were going to reserve the Kubernetes IO namespace for
yeah. Is that like, the way I interpret that is just like an admonishment to users? Like,
Yeah, that's
don't
what
put stuff there, it's gonna
it's really
break.
clear to me that if it was just, hey, don't do this, because if we step on you later, it's not our fault. Or if it was that we would have some mechanism to gate them somehow, like, I don't know, if it has Kubernetes IO as part of its name, then it'll have the correct signer stuff, and it must be a set of well-known names that we control or something. I don't know.
I mean, we do have the signer names that we claim. I think at minimum, you know, saying all of these are reserved for Kubernetes IO project, and if you do anything with them and you get stumped later, like, you'll be sad. Don't do that. That's the minimum we could do.
I mean, that's the state we're in right now, I think.
Yeah.
Maybe I think it's only documented in the CAP. No, it's documented in the website
The API.
documentation too.
My feeling is that that's probably sufficient. Like, these are cluster level APIs. We're not expecting namespace users, like low privilege users in the cluster, to have these. Integrators should use names that, like, we kind of took pains to, like, tie stuff to the signer name and give guidance around the signer name, saying, like, use a domain qualified name that you control. I feel like that's probably sufficient. I would like to see us use these for publishing trust roots for the Kubernetes signers, for things that we have the information for, like the client certificate one.
There's client cert, and then there's the Kube API server serving cert, right?
So I think we can publish the root for the Kube API server serving cert. We should not publish the root for Kube API server client certs, right? Because we don't want people to.
We already do. It's in the API server extensions config map in Kube system. So, like, it's already in a place. We would just be putting it in a better place.
Yeah, that. Yeah, the serving cert we put in the config map and mount into pods. I think that's good to also put in a trust bundle. The client cert we put into a config map for extension API servers to look at. That seems like a good thing to put into a trust bundle.
Oh, you're saying the client cert when Kube API server connects to something. I was talking about client certs for presenting the Kube API server.
No,
The client cert for presenting the API server.
Oh.
Like in practice, like a lot of clusters issue both off the same root, right?
I mean, not any OpenShift. Like,
okay, but I'm just like in a lot of cases, distributing the root for the serving cert has already done that, right?
Yeah, if you munge your trust roots together, like, then you're distributing both. But we've always told people, like, the CA that gets mounted into a pod is for verifying the Kube API server serving certificate. And so,
yeah,
like, having a trust bundle for that signer is like, if you want to verify the Kube API server, use this signer. If you want to verify client certificate,
I think that's right. That's the right thing to tell people, and the right expectation to set. But I just want to point out, like, people may have taken that dependency already, right?
Well, then publishing. So today you give those two pieces of information to Kube API server in two different flags. Like, in one flag, you tell Kube API server, here's the bundle for validating the serving certificate. And Kube API server puts that in config maps and mounts it into, those get mounted into pods. In another flag, you give the Kube API server, here's the bundle to validate client certificates. And so we're already telling the API server component, like, here's the two bundles. Maybe they're the same. Like, if they're the same in your cluster, okay, whatever. But we have distinct bundles that we should publish for distinct reasons and distinct trust bundles for distinct signer names.
So if there's none we want to hide, maybe what we can spec out is just saying for every signer that's documented in our documentation, we maybe, except maybe legacy unknown, we put a corresponding set of cluster trust bundles.
Seems reasonable.
Me.
So that would mean if you were running the in-tree signers, you could theoretically get cluster trust bundles present. But if you were explicitly disabling those signers,
Yeah, I mean, on GKA we disable them and we'd have to re-implement them in our.
The API server still is given the bundles to validate, not for signing, but the public keys to validate. So
Right. So I guess for which ones is it given?
all of them.
Oh, like node serving and stuff like that. I guess it has to because it has to connect the nodes. Okay. Oh wait. Well, we don't want. We want this logic in API server, not Kube controller manager.
I don't know. We can talk about where we want to put it. I'm just saying, like, the even if you're doing cert signing externally, the roots are still getting passed to at least Kube API server today. Maybe Kube controller manager. We have to look at where the information is getting passed. But even if you're doing external signing, the information is getting passed to Kube components with the public keys for those certs.
Yeah,
So,
I mean that's what I care about.
Okay, can we? So I think that is going to require us also to address the little question of what annotation or label do we use for designating the live set. So we can bring that up. It not here, but like in the KEP. Is it okay for me to submit another PR to the KEP and we can do this even though the enhancements cutoff is passed?
Yep. Yep.
Okay.
It's common to like have fit and finish questions that come up during implementation and just update those in the KEP. Yeah, that's totally fine.
Okay.
So I would, I guess, on that specific topic, have I just forgotten that we were going to do something with labeling for live and not live? I just don't remember ever
I think I had originally had it because it was a problem we need to solve, like for some GK use cases, I think. I guess it's down to like, and then it's in all the examples is this magical, not magical, just a suggested annotation that has like,
label.
If you give the value live, clients should understand that this is kind of like the thing to use. And maybe you have another, additional versions that you use for canarying or whatever.
I think we can be more opinionated about the labels we apply to the trust bundles for our signers. And if we want to establish a convention, that seems reasonable. Like there's already a lot of like signer specific documentation that's required. It's like, so you want to run a CSR signer, you need to spec out for your signer name, like what usages are permitted. Are there any special requirements? How does your approval process work? There's, you have to document all of that. Documenting, here's what we do or do not publish trust bundles, and we do or do not label them to indicate like canary or live or out of service or whatever. That would be part of your signer name documentation. And so we should be consistent across our signer names, and we could establish a convention that other people could follow, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. At the risk of opening the can of worms, revocation. My personal opinion is that we should not do anything about it right now, and that when I get my act together and get the pod certificate kept for 131, that we will have our own, like that those certificates will have, or the certificates that we spec out as like the client go API server client one will have their own rectification mechanism based on pod bindings and no other revocation mechanism.
I also don't think that revocation needs to be part of cluster trust bundle. like this instant. Like distribution of trust root is distinct from distribution of revocation information. Maybe this would give us a spot to hang it if we want. If we want to add revocation information in the future, we could do that compatibly.
So I think the two things. I think since roots can already have the ability to specify a CRL, I think at a minimum, I think we should tell people that it's possible to have one there, and if you want to use it, you may.
Isn't that just like it's in the X509 spec and you can see it there?
Well,
Like
I think we should put it in our
Doc.
documentation, right? Like,
Hey, when you
if want
consume a trust bundle that's mounted, remember that you can have this field, and you should consume the CRL if it's there. Like, it's not that big of a deal. I think that part should be present. That then allows us in the future, if we want to do something interesting, like perhaps on behalf of workloads, actually fetch the CRL and make it present for them locally, so they don't even have to try to do it themselves. That could be a thing we could do in the future. The second thing I was thinking about, to me, it would be very strange for us to let you configure these things in a way that the API server itself can consume them to mean something without it trying to do revocation.
say that again.
So today, when you configure like an admission webhook, you can just shove in a CA cert, and that's what the API server is going to use. What I'm saying is, if we make new usages of bundles with a client that we fully control, as in like the API server, we should do better and actually try to do revocation if the CA cert has it. And I built a
so like if there's a, I forget what the extension is called, but like when we connect to a webhook backend, we should wire up our X509 library to.
Yeah, and I have a link to it somewhere, right? But I'd POC'd this, just 50 lines or so.
This isn't different than today. You can put a CA into a webhook, and if that CA has a CRL, we ignore it.
No, I know. I'm more saying that we are going through an entire effort of greatly enhancing what's possible with certs in Cube. So why wouldn't we do better this time? Like basically, what I'm saying is what we do today is not what we should have done.
I don't know. I haven't, like, CRLs are basically an availability risk that I'm like, there's clear reasons why you might want to have that option, but they're also an ever-present availability risk that I don't think is mitigated.
Well, I mean, for a client like the API server, it's not a big deal, right? You just fetch the CRL every so often. You don't have to do it on inline, right? Like, it's a special client that we control that can actually do the right thing. Right? You are right. If I go to a random website, it might fail if I'm checking CRL because I've never gone there before. But the API server is a long-lived process. So it can just fetch it once and keep fetching it every couple of minutes or whatever. It's not going to mess up. It's not in line. Right? So I think the arguments against CRLs and other forms of revocation don't apply to a client like the API server, or at least they don't apply as strong.
I mean, API server is quite like a web browser. And I guess I think where we left off last time was we want to understand why like Chrome and Firefox gave up on this approach.
The last time I checked, they didn't give up. They went back and they implemented an incredibly complex way of caching the entire world's CRLs.
Sure, because they don't want to take the risk of like going and fetching it from the browser.
Right, but then they did that, and so they have it. Right. All I'm saying is we can just do the same thing, but in a much more lightweight way, which is like we just fetch it on startup and have it, because we don't need the entire world's revocation list in one go. We just need whatever's in our admission plugin config or whatever else we decide to use it for, right? So like we don't need like the fancy filtering and caching and compaction, but we get the same behavior, which is we know the revocation list and then we check against it. And we don't fetch the revocation list in line to doing anything critical. We only do that out of band. And
I
if
mean,
we,
what if somebody serves their webhook from like a real CA?
what's wrong with that?
Like their revocation list will be huge.
No, but that's
If they
still
publish them. I don't know.
that's not the issue because it's still one CA's revocation list, right? It's not the entire world's one, and you again are not doing it in line.
Yeah, I think this is orthogonal to cluster trust bundle. I think there are cases where you could have something that points at a CRL that would be problematic for Kube API server to consume. So figuring out what do we do at the edges if you point us at a CRL that is gigantic, or like, do we consider it blocking if even on startup we can't fetch this thing? Like, or do we just trust everything until we get a successful? I don't know. Like, I have a lot of questions about it, and it's not clear to me that we can do it.
I guess what I would ask though is if we don't do this now, when would we actually do it?
Never expire your certificates, people.
No, that's the point though, right? That we keep pushing this problem off indefinitely into the future and we never actually address it. And then people come to us saying, hey, why can't I do revocation? We just tell them we don't support that, right? But it's easy to say that, hey, have short-lived certs when you're a megacorp like the ones that we work at, because we have entire literal CAs that are publicly trusted that are fully automated and pinned, right? But that's not the actual experience of a regular using Cube, right? Like literally when people come to us, they're like, hey, I want to expire this one client cert that I handed out one time and I feel bad about it. And we're like, yeah, rotate your entire route because there is no way to expire that one serial number. Right? That is silly. Right? So that's why I'm trying to push to couple these things together so we actually do it.
Yeah,
Or we make the statement that we will never do it. And the answer is we just don't want to. Like it's too hard.
It's a bad idea to couple things we want to other things that aren't actually hard related to them. I don't want us to do that. I'm like, if I'm not gonna fight like someone trying to do revocation stuff in a way that we can do reliably and deals with edge cases, but coupling, like glomming too much onto an existing design because it's a thing we wanted to do a while ago and didn't get to, like, no, don't do that. Keep things
What extension mechanism would someone use, presumably, if they wanted to do this and we didn't? Or is there one we should provide?
There's CRLs built into X509. If we think we can start honoring those in a safe way, I would start honoring them in existing stuff, like phase that in a safe way. And you could start, you could do it feature gated. You could start by like warning and doing metrics like dry run node, like honor it and warn or throw a metric when you would have rejected a cert, like so people can phase it in safely. Like if we say we think we can do it safely, then why wouldn't we do it for existing CA bundles we already consume safely? I just don't see why it has to be coupled to this trust bundle feature.
Well, it's more about coupling it to the fact that when we consume it in a client like the API server, we're basically fully controlling the edges, and thus we can define the behavior. It's not like us saying, hey, it'd be really good if you consume the CRL that's in your bundle. So that's what you're supposed to do as a client. But yeah, I mean, the gist of what I'm hearing though is like, don't couple those things together. But I don't see anyone other than the set of people on this call who would actually push revocation forward, right? Because we're the only ones who have the technical capability of doing so.
Mo, I think I agree with you. I've been listening in and think revocation is a key thing that you should we should have in place. And I mean, I don't know all the details, but it seems like the CRL approach would be maybe the most doable and simplest. And I know there are issues. I've run into them before in other environments, but you got to try if you want to make this into a much more commercially robust implementation. All right, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, appreciate that. Let's see. Well, before we get too far off on the thing, did we cover the other items that we needed for this to hear?
I think the only other one was like, should we wire it into webhook configs? But I think I got my work cut out for me, even with just exporting the current signers.
Yeah, so my feeling is that we should not do anything that changes how API server gets CAs right now. Probably a good idea to figure out the answer before GA.
Not doing, say that again, not do anything to change what gets used.
Basically, I don't think API server should consume trust bundles yet. It can produce them. I don't think it should consume them.
Yeah, I think we probably want to get to GA before we start rippling out to references to trust bundles from things like API service or webhook admission or web conversion webhook type of fields. Like I could see that being done as like the next step of making stuff use it, but I think we should get it stable first.
Yeah, I guess, would you be okay with the framing of this, Kep, Jordan, that basically says this is about the allowing external clients to basically have the ability to consume this stuff, but it's not about our internal stuff consuming it. And
external clients and pods, yeah. Like it's an API that people can read from directly, or they can mount into pods. That's the scoping of this. Yeah.
I mean, I would agree with that. I think that's a reasonable size for this Kep, and it is already relatively large.
I had one sort of operational question, which is, do we need to take a deep, like, is it required that we stop, like, move from V1 Alpha 1 to V1 Beta 1 and then to V1, or is there some sort of shorter path we could take? Because it seems like this is not going to live for very long in any of the non-V1 API groups.
Like, are you asking?
Again, V1 behind a feature gate, the type isn't served or isn't supported.
Sorry, wait. So are you asking, should we skip beta? Is that what you're asking?
Not skip beta as a like launch phase, but skip beta as a, you have to write V1 beta 1 in your code. But, and you have to go update all references that were V1 alpha 1 to V1 beta 1, and then update all references that were V1 beta 1 to V1, even though it's the same object with the same fields.
So I think in this particular case, that is a benign problem because the primary client is the kubelet. And we will just make the kubelet handle all 3 API versions. Because
okay.
That's what we did with CSRs, right? We made it work. Because I don't think the regular use case is to directly make REST API calls against them, right? So the dependency your application should take is having
controllers will.
Oh, like to create them?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even then, I don't know if that's that bad. Like having a V1 API that's not on by default doesn't make sense. It's not V1 then.
Yeah, I would just progress it to beta. Going from alpha to V1 is strange in that the when you graduate to V1, you really want the previous version of the API server to have like non-alpha level support for the thing. And so if you graduate types directly from alpha to V1, then that's sort of a weird position to be in. Like the current release of API servers, like these types are V1 and stable. And the previous version of the API server is like these types are alpha and unstable.
Yeah.
And beta does have stronger stability guarantees than alpha. So like beta, we say data will be forward compatible, and alpha, we don't make any guarantees. Like that's sort of my
I'm just
mental.
coming from it like one of the largest customer complaints we get is like when they upgrade their cluster, a bunch of software stops working, not for any real reason, but because a string changed from V1 alpha 1 or V1 beta 1 to V1.
This
Yeah.
is why
Well,
we go to
that won't happen. That won't happen now because the beta won't be on in their cluster unless they specifically opted into it, which cuts exposure to unstable, not yet GA APIs from
Sure.
like ambient on by default to a handful who particularly wanted to try out a beta thing. Like it cuts exposure to that down to almost nothing. Yeah, we'll progress this through beta, even if we're only in beta a release or two, that's fine.
Okay.
All right, we're out of time. Just a really quick mention, we're doing an API review on the reference grant stuff tomorrow. So if anyone is interested, I'll drop a link to that in Slack probably. People can jump in and listen in. Yeah, just wanted to boost that.
All right, yo. Think we'll see everybody in 2 weeks. Well, take care.
Thank you. Bye.